Yep.
We can hear you. Hello.
Perfect. Hi there.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hey there. How's it going?
Oh, well, depends. What you tell us, I guess.
Yeah. Well, that's why I wanted to kind of preface it with like, I don't have any terrible news or good news really to report. We'll just talk to you guys about what we're seeing and then like certain notices that if you get what to give back to us.
Well, and I guess, I mean, there is some good news.
Yeah, it's just not
Definite.
correct.
All
And
right.
I
So,
don't necessarily trust as much as I could.
yeah.
Um,
We're up to 60. Probably.
we are up to 57.
Can you hear me?
I can. Hello.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, well, we can get started. It's 2:34, and as people trickle in, they're gonna be more than welcome to answer some questions, to ask any questions. So just to get started, Peter and I will give you guys a brief update of what we have, and then we're happy to answer any questions that you all have. My guess is you all have the same types of questions, so that hopefully this is efficient. So first, we've noticed over the past several months that on, I don't know, 2% of claims or something like that, we've gotten some weird notices that have been issued by the IRS regarding those claims. Some of the notices say things like, hey, we got your return. If this return is incorrect, please let us know and withdraw your claim. If it is not incorrect, then continue. But it's got no information. It's kind of a scary notice, and it talks about nothing other than possibly your claim being fraudulent based on no information. So it's a really small percentage of cases, and it doesn't look like there's any actual pattern in how they were selected.
If I can just real quick before we get
Yeah.
into some of that kind of stuff, just to make sure that we're all at a baseline understanding
Sure.
of where we're at. There was a moratorium put in place last September, September 14th. Commissioner says, I'm not processing any returns related to ERC that are filed after that date. He says, nevertheless, that they will continue to process returns that are filed before September 14th, but it'll be at a slower clip. In that information release, it talks about instead of being 90 days to process, which was never the case, it's going to be 180 days.
Which was also never the case.
Yeah.
On their best day.
But what in reality has happened is that no returns have been processed since mid to late August, except for very limited circumstances where we're given it a push. And generally speaking, that pushes through the Taxpayer Advocate Service. So we can talk a little bit about that later. But that's where we're at and why we're here is that, you know, some of you may say, well, I was filed before April 14th. My return should be processed. Yeah, I mean, agreed. That's what the commissioner has said. That's what he told Congress. That's what the messaging has continued to be, including in an information release as late as last Friday, where he says the same thing, and it just simply isn't true. And so in the meantime, and what Rebecca's talking about is we have seen these strange letters that seem to be no rhyme or reason to who has received these letters or anything like that. The commissioner has told us that they're undertaking a scanning effort
Project.
to basically digitize all these returns that have come in on paper and are now, you know, being processed by humans, but they're being scanned, and what they do with these scans frankly, we don't know. I don't know why you needed to scan unless they're looking for patterns across these returns. But we thought maybe, okay, you get one of these letters, it means it's been scanned, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And
Just
so,
because of the amount of letters we've received, the amount of claims that we have filed is hugely disproportionate.
yeah.
And in the original like moratorium press release, it was stated that the moratorium would be in effect till at least December 31st. And now it's March 26th. And we truly haven't heard, I mean, he keeps saying things like, I hope to have the moratorium lifted by the spring or late spring.
So he told
But it's
Congress in
certainly
February when he
not a
testified,
guarantee.
he committed to begin processing again, wouldn't commit to a date. There was an information release from last Friday where the commissioner again commits to beginning processing and says something to the effect of, I hope it can begin late spring. No idea what late spring means.
Or why he's hopeful when he's in charge. He can make the decision himself.
Yeah, so
We're
that
hopeful. He should be a little bit more in the processing.
so the other good news, and I don't know, with a lot of you guys, we probably didn't talk about this, but they have to pay overpayment interest, on these refunds. So actually, the delays are causing the American taxpayers even more in interest payments that need to be paid. Interest is not cheap right now. Do you know what the number is? 7-8%, something like that?
7% for corporations, yeah, for businesses,
For
7%.
LLCs, it's a little bit lower number for
For
corporations.
C corps, yeah.
That's just statutory, not just C corps, but any corporation, including nonprofits. So, that's just statutory language that overpayment interest is less for a corporation than it is for a partnership. But it's more than you can get on the street. So, an added bonus.
But as far as what's like kind of happening in this space is the IRS said in one of these press releases that they are going to start the scanning effort that was going to take them 4 months to scan these paper returns. And they're going to use these AI and certain type of technologies to help the audit process. So maybe like a W-2 matching, making sure that these companies exist and that their employees match their 941s and all of that kind of stuff. But I'll say I have not seen a huge enforcement action on these claims, and we kind of had expected to see it. We expected to see a ton of audits, even just like a correspondence audit, which would be like a letter asking you to send back information. We've seen some of these again. Some of these notices we're getting are like, hey, do you want to withdraw? And some of these other notices are like, hey, we got your claim, give us this information. I think we've gotten one of them, or maybe not even. A company that we know maybe got one, but we're not getting anywhere near the enforcement that we thought was going to happen, which would open up the processing of these returns where there might be some sort of request for information. I know at least some of you, we've talked before that the 941s have very little information on them that show why you're eligible for the credit and how you calculated the credit. And so we were kind of hoping that the IRS would start asking those questions so they could get that information and making decisions about what to process and what not. Some of you have gross receipt claims that are very, very straightforward. In which case, there's no reason that those should be held up based on like a suspension of operations case. Some of those are more straightforward, some of them are less straightforward. Obviously, we filed all of your claims. We have good faith that your claims are accurate based on all of our information that we have, but it's a different analysis for a gross receipt claim than it is for a suspension of operations claim. So we're surprised that we have not seen more enforcement action, in this space at all, really.
And I will
Handful.
just, because I think this is incredible. there was a criminal complaint filed in, I believe, New Jersey, related to ERC fraud. It was a conspiracy charge and a mail wire fraud charge. Attempted tax loss was $2.9 billion generated by only 3 individuals. So the commissioner's concerns are real. And there was a whole lot of fraud going on here, and the government actually paid those guys close to $1 million before they caught on
Notice.
to it. So that, keep that in your mind as the backdrop of like the stuff that the commissioner really is right to be concerned about. Now, just because there's fraud out there, there's fraud out in the world all the time, every day, it doesn't mean that, you know, the folks who are on this call shouldn't still be entitled to their refund claims. But just to put it in perspective, that is the most recent filing that I've seen criminal activity. They're up to, I think previously they said there were 252 criminal investigations. Now it's closer to 350 active investigations. But to Rebecca's point, I mean, the key here really is watch your mailbox. Make sure you're checking the mail frequently. If for some reason the address that you use on the tax returns is something other than, you know, where you're typically at, if it's a virtual mailbox or something along those lines, just make sure you're checking it, because some of these notices have a relatively quick turnaround. From what we have heard, and a lot of what we're hearing isn't happening to our clients. So along the way, when you're trying to do this stuff the right way, you meet other folks who are trying to do this right way. We've encountered a group of, I think it was probably 45 to 50 attorneys and CPAs from, I don't know, maybe 20 or 25 different firms, also trying to do it the right way. And so Rebecca and I meet with this crew bi-weekly, more or less bi-weekly. And we just hop on a phone call for an hour and talk through what we're seeing. We share copies of correspondence
Notices,
that
yeah.
clients are getting, understanding the lay of the land. And so the one that we're particularly talking about here is an information document request that we have seen go out to folks. It's captioned as a letter 6612, and it gives you a very short turnaround, and it basically says, hey, prove to us what, prove to us your eligibility. And it's no surprises. They're not pulling any shots here. It's exactly what they said they were going to ask for. So that's why we did the work on the front end. So, you know, these responses, if you happen to receive them, should be fairly straightforward. So, but the point is, one of the terms of this, and this is frankly flabbergasting, is that, you know, if you don't reply to this notice within 30 days, they're just going to disallow the claim. And disallowing a claim sets off a whole other thing, and now you're doing protests with appeals, or there's litigation or that kind of stuff. So just want to make sure you're watching your mailbox and make sure that if for some reason you receive, one of these notices, you touch base with us and we respond quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of pictured that we would get floods of these notices, and so we're getting like 2. Jeffrey Wood just asked, will it come by mail or email? And it's going to come by mail. And like one of my clients got a notice that was dated February 26th, and I got it on March 10th. And she also got it on March 10th, which gives you an even shorter window to respond, because you just lost the first 14 days of your response. And that's just one of those things. So we just had to hurry up and get it in, which is fine. But if you miss that March 10th mail, we should get a copy. But if we don't, for some reason, You just want to make sure that you're paying attention to this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the only other thing, that we're tracking and following is what's going on with this tax bill. You guys all filed, prior to January 31st, which is, the deadline that they're trying to move the ERC stuff to. Was passed in early February and nothing's really happened. We're tracking some developments where they might sort of bypass the finance committee and the Senate and take it directly to the floor, meaning it's not going through markup. There's no changes or anything like that. But maybe that happens. But really, it won't, doesn't directly affect anything related to you guys because you're already filed.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is there any concern that they'll roll back that date to maybe the moratorium date?
So
I
not if
got
it
it like
doesn't,
two days after the moratorium date.
right. It would have to go through some sort of markup. So if it went through the finance committee, yeah, I mean, they could do that and then they'd have to go back in conference with the House. But if the majority leader takes it back out of the committee and puts it just on the floor, I don't think they will change any of those terms, because as soon as they open one thing up to amendments, you're off to the races. And frankly, nobody's worried about that bill as far as ERC is concerned. They are all thinking of it as the
Child tax credit.
child
Yeah.
tax credit and the TCJA changes. So I don't think there's much of a chance that it gets rolled back to the moratorium.
At this point, there was a period of time when the House had it that we thought really anything could happen.
Okay.
Is the program funded, or is it being funded in tranches?
There's no funding for it, which is why the tax bill is funny, because they're trying to pay for new tax credits by cutting off a tax credit that was never properly in the budget to begin with. Do you remember what they budgeted for it, Peter? It was like nothing, and then they've spent quite a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is different than like PPP, which ran out of
Right.
money. So that's probably what you're channeling. That's not what this is at all. This is just a claim on the general fund.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
If we have not heard anything, does that mean that they've even gotten a claim? Did you guys get something after you filed, or I haven't heard anything?
If you shoot me a private message, I can respond to you directly, but
Okay.
our staff pull transcripts every 2 weeks, or after 2 weeks of filing, to make sure it hit the transcript. Meaning, make sure that they've received it, so I can just double check for you.
Gotcha.
But that should be happening with all of our cases.
Okay. So do you think at some point too, they may just say, hey, you know what? We ended it. Anybody who didn't receive anything by now will not get anything.
I think that's unlikely, given one, it's an election year, and two, there are some folks, and I didn't see this person on the call, but maybe he's called in. There are some folks where we filed in July of 22. It's a restaurant, and he is still waiting for one of his quarters. It would seem to be very arbitrary to do something like that, because some claims, like the way the IRS processed it, there's a huge backlog. And things were getting processed slowly. And then for some reason last summer, around this time, like around April, May, maybe it was right after April 15th, things started speeding up really quickly, where you filed and you were getting a refund. Like, it was moving very fast. And so some folks were getting refunds within 4 months. And that's what we thought was going to be the standard. And then so some people from the beginning part, where that initial backlog was still stuck in that group and never really kind of came out of it. And then they had the moratorium. So it was like no processing, slow processing, tons of processing, and then an absolute stop. So I don't think they would make a claim like that. I mean, I think they could say, okay, this January 31st deadline, that could be something. I think they could say September 14th, let's do that. I mean, they could do all kinds of things. But I don't think it's likely to say that just in general, all claims that were filed that haven't been processed won't be processed.
Okay.
So to answer, I'll put my spin on this, Andy.
Yeah.
If they do that, they're not going to tell you. They're just not going to process the return. Is my guess. There is no affirmative duty of the commissioner to process these returns. Yet, at least. I mean, there's some litigation out there where the argument, it's a case called SoCal Medical, where they are arguing that there's shall language in the statute, and that means the commissioner shall. And they piggyback off of the taxpayer bill of rights and the language from the statute and said, look, you have this duty to do it. But I don't think it's a very strong argument. But who knows? So maybe they'll generate and make some law, but otherwise the way it works is they put the burden back on the taxpayer to prosecute a claim, and you do that through federal court litigation. So you file a lawsuit and you say, I want my refund, give it to me. And so we are going to be seeing more and more of those coming as more and more people continue to get frustrated by the delays. And so I guess stay tuned with some of that stuff, because if that happens, and sort of the reason that I don't know if it'll happen, and I tend to agree with Rebecca, is that you're going to have a whole lot of angry federal court
Constituents.
judges who are having to deal with this stuff, and it was never intended for them to deal with it. What I don't think they will do is do just one large disallowance. A disallowance is a very formal thing in the tax code. It's something where it is mailed by certified registered mail to disallow the claim, because that would flood initially at least their own appeals division. And so you're just moving something from processing or exam to appeals, and I don't think there's much of a palette for that. So commissioner's in a tough spot. I mean, there's no question. There's a lot of not great choices, but that's at least the way the law works there.
But most likely that's not going to be the case. They're not going to just not process. He keeps saying anyway that he's going to. So until that messaging changes, I think we can presume that that's not the case. We have a couple. Go ahead.
Is there a statute of limitations issue if there's been no disallowance?
Forever. No, if there's a disallowance, it triggers a clock. But if there's no action, you're just out there until you decide, to pursue a refund claim.
So speaking of refund claims, someone has asked about filing a Form 911 with the taxpayer advocate. So we can kind of talk about that. So for folks that have filed more than 6 months ago, so that would be, pre-moratorium claims, basically.
Yeah.
And they are suffering a financial hardship, and they would like us to advocate on their behalf to the taxpayer advocate. We are happy to do that. We'd like to talk to you first before we do that, and we can include that in our engagement.
But just so everybody knows, taxpayer advocate is an independent part of the IRS. It's still part of the IRS, so it's not fully independent, but instead of reporting to the commissioner or to the Secretary of the Treasury, it reports directly to Congress through an annual report. The taxpayer advocate has the ability to issue TAOs, taxpayer assistance orders, in certain limited circumstances, one of which is the processing of a return. So what Rebecca's saying is, we can go in to the taxpayer advocate and say, look, we've identified this systemic delay. This systemic delay is creating a financial hardship for the taxpayer, that's one of the enumerated reasons that a taxpayer advocate can get involved. It's not necessarily a fast process. I think their stated goal is to open a case within 30 days, but it's probably closer to 80 or 90. I don't know, Rebecca.
It takes a while, and it's getting worse because people are filing these claims. But the claims that we have had processed are because of the taxpayer advocate. I'm not going to say it's a lot. It is more than we have those notices for, but not by a lot. So like, we've gotten maybe 5, I think, claims processed through this procedure, and we started doing it well before the moratorium.
But just because the case is open doesn't mean you're already across the finish line. So the way the taxpayer advocate works is case manager gets the case, they call, they say, hey, I've been assigned your case. I need to, review the file and do some research. I'm going to call you back in 30 days. 30 days go by, they call, they say, hey, I've looked into it, but I need another 30 days. 30 days go by, hey, I need another 30 days. So you're basically doing quick little snippets every 30 days until they're able to get the return on a TAO. It's our understanding that they are doing bulk TAOs. So they're, one TAO with a whole bunch of, EIN saying, go find this return and process it. So effective, yes, we've had some success. The commissioner acknowledged during his testimony in February that they are following TAOs. He also mentioned congressional sort of constituent service offices that have been noisy.
What he said specifically are the only claims that have gotten processed are ones where you got your congressman involved or the taxpayer advocate, which one day, if anyone wants to have a side conversation about it, I'm happy to do so, because it's ridiculous to say, I'm only going to do my job if a congressman gets involved. And then I'm not going to have any scrutiny. I'm just going to push it through after all of this. Anyway, side conversation.
Have you given any thought to this longer delay being due to the March 22nd deadline for people pulling back their claims?
So the March 22nd deadline, there was a press release issued last week that said 500 businesses have gone through the program and another 800 were pending. So it's 1,300 businesses nationwide that took advantage of the voluntary disclosure program, which I think the IRS was disappointed. They didn't say that in their press release, but
they weren't counting 11th hour submissions. That number will tick up, but yeah,
it will.
It was very low for as much noise as they had been making about it.
And I mean, they issued the voluntary disclosure program in December. And part of like their messaging is, go to a tax advisor, go to a, tax attorneys, like meet Peter, go to people that you trust and then make a decision of whether or not you're eligible for this voluntary disclosure program or if your claim is good. And it's just not that many folks taking advantage of it. It could very well be that they're taking a longer time because of the voluntary disclosure program. But again, it doesn't seem like there's a ton of compliance being done to determine whether or not these claims are accurate ahead of time. There's another question. So is there an additional cost that Frost Law prepare and file Form 911 on our behalf? Reach out to me directly and I can look and see. For some folks, it may be a small cost, and for some, we'll roll it into the engagement. It just kind of depends on the type of engagement. Okay, our CPA suggested that we should be filing amended tax returns for 2020 and 2021 to reflect ERC credited income in those years, given that the window to amend 2020 is dwindling. Thoughts? So I'll kick that one over to Peter.
Thanks. Yeah, so what's happening is, the due dates here are all driven by the refund statute expiration date. There's also something called the assessment statute expiration date, and that's the same day. So what's happening is the government can't make an assessment on a tax return after ASED runs, assessment statute expiration date. For 2020, for a 1040 or for a C Corp return, The government can't legally make an assessment after April 15th, 2024. There are, of course, some exceptions to the rule related to, substantial understatement of income and some fraud and that kind of stuff. But the general rule, and so they're in a real pickle because they're not processing these returns. You don't have the funds in hand, and they certainly want you to amend these returns and generate tax and pay it. And I mean, I did a call with somebody yesterday or last week who did that, followed the government's instructions, now owes 56,000, doesn't have the ability to pay. And ultimately, and I didn't really evaluate well, I guess we did talk about there wasn't the strongest claim. And I identified some concerns. They had just ended up withdrawing and then are going to fix their tax liability. But be aware that it's just the operation of Code Section 280C. The government wants you to amend, and they said that any penalties associated, they'll call it reasonable cause and abate. But what you choose to do between now and April 15th is hard because again, you don't have the funds.
So, I mean, that is also, I have a similar story, except for a client called me off the street and owed $1 million to the IRS because she had done what the IRS wanted her to do. She was a government contract, like she owned a government contracting business. And so she couldn't have a lien. So now she had a controversy case and that's what she was hiring me for, is to make sure she didn't have a lien, to make sure I could kind of hold the IRS collection efforts at bay while everything kind of processed and we evaluated her claim and all of that. But it's really putting folks in a very tricky situation because yes, the IRS wants you to take that expense deduction right away, but it could take a long time. So there's a question in the in the chat that said, I heard that this will take up to 15 years. I sure hope not. I've heard nothing that's going to be 15 years.
I haven't heard that, but
I sure hope not. Unlike Danny Werkle, who hopes the moratorium is going to end and he has full control over it, I hope that it will not be 15 years. The audit statute that they are kicking around in Congress right now is 6 years from the date of processing. So 15 years feels very long, given those parameters. I'm not sure you're hearing that, but that seems tricky. 15 years would be tough. Denise asked, have you gotten any favorable responses to going through the taxpayer advocate? Yes, so we've gotten a couple through. I think in general, the response is favorable. It's just another very large, understaffed, under-resourced government agency that isn't able to do what they should be able to do. And so, like everything else, it just takes a long time. And also, like, unfortunately, who you get makes a big difference. You get a good taxpayer advocate, you're in a better spot. The way the taxpayer advocate works is there's a national taxpayer advocate, and then each state has its own local office, and then each office has a taxpayer advocate, and then they have caseworkers. So in that realm, you're being assigned to somebody down here if you escalate it to a manager and then maybe to that person. Sure. So to go back to the 2020 returns, Susan is asking if they're obligated to file an amended return before 4/15 if you have a pending ERC application, so pending ERC return for 2020.
So there's no affirmative duty to file a tax return, an amended tax return. It's really, the idea is you want to, when you do file an amended tax return, that it is considered a qualified amended return. The regs for that, basically establish a qualified amended return when you file the return before the government is proposing any adjustments. Meaning you get the return in before the government says, hey, we're going to penalize you or add interest or anything like that. The challenge, if you choose to do that after April 15th, is that while I think the government will take your money and post it to the account, they're not able to make that assessment. And so that amount remains a credit, which is just a little bit awkward. But I mean, if you make the payment after you receive it, it certainly shows good faith. It's just not nice and buttoned up, but so much of this with ERC is not, that way. But there's no like affirmative duty ever to file an amended return. You should certainly because of the operation at 280 cap C, but the timing is a choice that you're going to have to make. It's not something, certainly the government has said they want you to do it right away, but that's hard.
John Belak has his hand raised. John, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? John, you are still
Can I
muted. There we
Can
go.
I circle
Hello.
back? This is not John, but can I circle back to that one more time on the April 15th date?
Sure.
So by statute, you should file your amended returns for 2020 by April 15th, which is
Correct.
potentially going to cause you a tax liability, but you haven't got the refunds to pay the tax liability. Is that what
Correct.
we're saying?
Yep.
And that, so if you do that, and then you end up getting not getting your refunds because they end the program.
So that's the other piece of this
Armageddon.
is, yeah, you might want to be filing a protective claim if you do file. So if you are looking to file those tax returns, reach out to me or Peter, and we can kind of talk about what a protective claim in the income tax return context would look like.
The protective claim really is something that you would need to file after you make the payment to protect the refund statute, which would then generate a new refund statute, and you'd have 2 years from the date of payment to put that protective claim in. But generally speaking, broadly speaking, a protective claim is a judicially created, I guess, doctrine that allows to hold open a particular statute of limitations because of some identified contingency. And there's very specific ways that you need to file it to make sure that it's considered a protective claim. But you'd really only be you'd be concerned about refund statute stuff after payment.
Okay.
They really made this as complicated as possible for some things that just like shouldn't be this complicated.
I mean, my guess is most people are not going to do that.
That's correct.
But if you were like, a major rule follower, right, and you followed what the IRS said, and you filed back in, let's say early 2022, and you amended and filed your returns, you're the type of person who absolutely should be thinking protective claim, just to protect your interest. So if you fall into that fact pattern, certainly speak to us or your CPAs, because we didn't really get into the income tax side of that, through any engagement. We focused on the ERC analysis.
Thanks.
John, did you still have your hand raised?
There's some stuff in the chat too. What's that?
I read it.
Okay.
I think I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've gone through all the chats and all the questions.
And then, well, Susan's question, yeah, I mean, the analysis is different for 2021. It's the following year. I mean, it's still just the key is having it be a qualified amended return.
Especially if you're a company that has, I don't know, several partners and you're dealing with several partners' returns and having to coordinate all of that in your on here, it makes it more challenging, obviously. David? And feel free, Elise, we'll send a thank you for folks for being here. Can you put me and Peter's contact information in there so people can call us or email us directly? If they've got any questions that they, you know, as soon as we get off the call that comes to them and they want to hear it and understand it, we're happy to do that. We know this is murky, so we're going to keep trying to have these kind of fireside chats, just like question and answer sessions, where we can kind of answer everyone's questions in a group. I think it's helpful for people to hear other people's questions and answers for things that they may not have thought of yet. And if there's certain things where multiple people have that question, it is, you know, more efficient. Okay, so Elise actually put our contact information in chat. Most of you should have our contact information. I know Vincent does. Others should. If not, you know, reach out to your case manager and they can get us information as well. And then we're happy to answer any one-off questions, especially
Yeah,
about.
don't hesitate to come directly to us if you guys have questions.
We're fine. All right, thanks, Vincent. Take care. But also, I forget what I was gonna say. Probably wasn't that important. Thanks for coming. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
All right, well, take
Thanks.
care. Have a
Thank
good one.
you.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you, guys.